You want to come to the other side and repeat the inspection for this side, both front and back. Spring hangers, spring stack, U-bolts, front and back, and the front spring hanger. While you're also in this area, you want to look at the shock absorber, which is right here. This is the shock absorber. There should be no evidence of any leaking or any damage to these devices. There's one on this side, and there's also one over here on this side. Okay, that pretty much covers the front suspension of the truck. We'll be looking at the rear suspension when we get back towards the back of the truck. After we look at the front suspension, we're going to take a look at the front brakes and the front wheels from the inside. Remember, you're going to be on a creeper on your back, but there's plenty of ground clearance and you should be able to get under the truck and have a look at these areas. Okay, this is the rotor. It should be shiny and free of any oil or other contaminants. That indicates that you have good even wear on the brake shoes and that there's nothing damaged on the brake shoes or the rotor. The wheel itself should be dry and free of any oil or any type of obvious fluid leaks. On the top, you'll see the brake chamber with the air brake hose that goes into the chamber. Now we're going to move to the back and you'll be able to see the air chamber mechanism and how it connects to the actual brake rotor and applies force to stop the wheel. If you look back in this area, you'll see the brake chamber again that I spoke of. And there's a rod that comes out of the brake chamber. When you step on the brake pedal, this rod is pushed out. It turns that linear motion into a rotary motion in this area, and it puts pressure on the two brake shoes that are in this area and squeezes that rotor and applies the brakes. What we're looking for in this area, again, is any obvious damage to the hose lines, okay? Any loose bolts or fasteners on the brake chamber rod that comes out, or any other obvious signs of problems in this area. Okay, we're going to go to the other side and we're going to check the right side brake chamber for the same things. You can see it up there. There's the airline, the brake chamber, the attaching hardware, and once again, a nice clean shiny rotor in this area.
Ready.
Okay, once we've had a look at the steering components, the suspension components, and the front brake components, we're going to take a look at the engine itself, the lower part of the radiator hose, and then we're going to look at the transmission. In this area, you can see the lower radiator hose that comes out and goes through a heat exchanger, also known as the engine cooler. When the engine temperature, when you're operating and it gets up to the higher limits, if you open the engine cooler, what happens is water from the pump flows through this heat exchanger and cools the radiator fluid that flows out of the lower hose through the heat exchanger and then back up into the engine itself. So this is your auxiliary engine cooler. This is where the cooling happens on the engine when you open the engine cooler valve. We're looking for any obvious leaks, and like I said, any damage, any signs of damage from foreign objects hitting this area while it's going down the road. In this area, we're going to have a look at the engine itself. You can see the oil pan of the engine. You can see the oil filter. Now, on these older trucks that have some mileage on them, you're going to see some seepage here. You're going to see some discoloration from the road grime, but there's no active leaks that creates a puddle on the ground. If it creates a puddle on the ground, it's considered a significant leak and must be reported. But this minor seepage here is normal. All right? If you zoom in right over here, you'll see the engine starter. And then the engine goes from about here back to where the transmission attaches to it, right in this area. So you have the engine up front, and then this silver blob right here is the transmission. Okay, as you can see right here, this is the back side of the transmission. This is where the output shaft produces transmits the power from the engine through the transmission to the front drive shaft. This front drive shaft goes from the transmission back to the transfer case. Back to the transmission. You can see these large hydraulic lines. There should be no obvious leaks in this area, and of course no damage to the transmission. You can see right here the exhaust pipe that comes out of the hot section of the turbocharger comes into the muffler. This area should be inspected for any looseness, any deterioration of the clamps, or any loose and attaching hardware or damage to the muffler itself. It should be intact and cylindrical, and the tailpipe should be attached correctly, and it should flow out through the tailpipe on the side of the truck. If you see any large areas of black sooty contamination, that's indicative of a leak and must be reported immediately. Okay, back to the drive shaft. As I spoke earlier, the power is transmitted from the transmission through this drive shaft. It's really important that you look at this drive shaft, make sure it's not damaged. On this side you have what's called a U-joint, and on the back side is a U-joint. Okay? These bolts should be in place around each of the 4 sections of the drive shaft, and there should be no obvious deformity. If you have a problem in this area, it can manifest itself by either vibration when you go down the road or a loud clunking noise when you go from neutral to drive or neutral to reverse. So if the drive shaft is intact, that brings us back to the transfer case. But before we get to that, there's a brake component right here that we want to look at. This is the reservoir for the front brake system. Okay, this is a pressure vessel. It should not have any obvious signs of damage, and you want to look at all the connectors and the attachments and the tie straps and make sure that they're all in place. This device right here is our air dryer and moisture ejector. This is what you hear when we do the CDL test, and periodically this will blow out the moisture out of the air brake system. So we want to look at this and make sure that there's nothing amiss in this area. Back to the transfer case. Now when I talk about the transfer case, I'm talking about how the power is transmitted from the transmission into the transfer case and then up into the pump housing, and that drives the pump. So when we shift from road to pump, we're transmitting the power through the transfer case and upward into the pump module. And if you pan in closely up here, right above the transfer case is the actual pump housing. This is where the pump impeller is. This is a single stage pump, and the impeller is right here by my finger, encased inside that pump housing. This group of lines is the low point drain for the pump and all the water that's in the pumping system. So in frigid temperatures, you can drain all the water out of it so that you don't have any damage. All right? This component right here is the prime motor. This is the prime motor, and this is the primer pump that we use when we draft at a static water source, or we use it to evacuate the air out of the centrifugal pump. It's a 12-volt pump, and it's a rotary gear. It's a 12-volt motor, 12-volt motor, and a rotary gear type positive displacement pump.